main currents of thought? Because a lot of us now, we don't really have a connection to what was like sort of core ideas he picked out in Judaism that he wanted to emphasize. Could Rav maybe get across some for us?
Again, we're still really not recovered. I don't think we'll ever fully recover from losing Rav Schiller. I guess one sad aspect of it is how few of the Talmidim in Ohr Somayach even knew Rav Schiller, or you saw him come on Rosh Hashanah, whatever it would be. But at that point, he wasn't even speaking, giving drushos or shiurim. So many of you never had a chance to get to know him, and that's a really, really big loss. He was a phenomenally gifted speaker in the English language. But I would say that one of the core ideas he had in the tshuva process is that tshuva is not about making yourself different. It's about acknowledging who you are and taking who you are and utilizing it as a mechanism of serving Hashem. So he often emphasized that the concept is not to obliterate your identity, but to utilize your identity to create your own unique relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You know, a Baal Tshuva, especially when you come to yeshiva, often faces a lot of pressure. Some of it is internal and some of it is external, to kind of give up their past life, almost make believe, you were a different type of person. And the problem with that is, that's like amputating a limb. Now, if you amputate a limb, there's still going to be phantom pain. There's going to be aspects of your past that are going to reemerge and trouble you and the like. And there's also, frankly, a problem of catch-up, because if the idea is that the only definition of a good Jew is somebody who's been frum all of their life, I have the obvious problem. Well, then God put me in a situation where I didn't have an opportunity to come to him for 20 years. I start with a tremendously unfair advantage. Where's the justice of that? But if you understand that wherever Hashem put you is what you need, where you needed to be as part of your journey, then the same way, there are many things that Me'ah Sharim Yid has that you'll never have. But it's equally true, there are many things you have that the Me'ah Sharim Jew doesn't have. Meaning, if you grew up in South Dakota, I use that as an example, but Rav Schiller, you might use baseball, but this is a point he made over and over again. There is something in South Dakota that is essential to your identity as a Jew. And therefore, we're not talking about amputating, we're talking about capturing, transforming, utilizing, sublimating. This was a point that he made very, very often, that you don't destroy. Tshuva is not a process of destroying yourself. It's a process of kind of using who you are to create the individuality and uniqueness of your identity as an Eved Hashem. Now, besides that, there were so many other ideas he talked about. I mean, a very famous statement he made, which is quite a profound idea. You ask a person, what's the definition of free will? What's the definition of bechira? So most people will say, well, I have the freedom, the choice to do whatever I want. So he said, no, every animal can do what it wants. Bechira is the choice to do what you don't want to do because it's a good thing to do, or the choice not to do what you want to do. Bechira is not doing what you want and not doing what you want. Bechira is the ability to overcome your natural inclinations because of something better and higher. And that's actually a very profound idea. And he also often made the point that the philosophical problems people have with Judaism are ultimately psychological problems. Meaning, he says, let's imagine, people say, well, how do I know the Torah is from God? And how do I know, it wasn't made up by the rabbis or whatever it is? He says, let's imagine we had a Torah that simply said, you can do whatever you want, you can eat whatever you want. He says he doesn't think people would have so many philosophical problems. How do I know it's true? The point basically is that it's really the psychological idea of dealing with commitment that creates in our minds all sorts of philosophical problems. So you do have to separate sometimes philosophy from psychology. Actually, it's reminiscent of a famous word of the Beis Halevi. Somebody went to the Beis Halevi once and said, I have kashas, I have questions of emunah. So the Beis Halevi said, you don't have kashas, you don't have questions, you have answers. Maybe your questions are excuses not to make certain commitment. I mentioned in my hesped, in fact, I think I wrote an article, I don't know where it's going to be, but it'll be somewhere in Ohr Somayach, that one of the, it's interesting. On one hand, he was a very brilliant person, very intelligent person, and he was a very committed person. He was committed to the truth, committed to Torah, committed to Kiruv, committed to build Ohr Somayach. So if you take those two combinations, very bright and very committed, they'll tend to create a kind of dictatorial personality, strong personality in which everybody has to do it his way. It's either my way or the highway. And yet he was not that way. He had a genuine appreciation, based on the reasons that I gave you. He had a genuine appreciation for the diversity of human personality. He didn't want to make you in his image, and he didn't want to make Ohr Somayach a cookie-cutter yeshiva. That's why we have Rebbeim. We're blessed or challenged sometimes with Rebbeim who espouse somewhat different philosophies. Now, there is a common denominator, obviously. Every Rebbe, passionately loves Torah and hopefully passionately loves their Talmidim, right? So those are the requirements. But other than that, people have many different hashkafas. There are Zionists in the Rebbeim, and there are, very anti-Zionist. What's the pshat? What does the yeshiva stand for? The answer is the yeshiva stands for the ability to espouse different shittas. And that comes from Rav Schiller, who was not a dictator. He did not say, this is my shita and this is what you gotta. In fact, in that sense, he almost exhibited a certain passivity, meaning he let people go where they needed to go. He let people explore what they needed to explore, because he often said, every student is unique, and every student might need a unique type of Rebbe. So the Rebbe who works for one Talmud might not work for another Talmud. So we'll have another Rebbe who works with that Talmud, you see? And that's a little rare, because normally when people start yeshivas, I'm just giving a generalization, they have a certain vision of exactly the type of product they want to produce, and every Rebbe will be hired based on how close they are to that vision. Rav Schiller's vision was much more of a decentralized type of vision, in which there needed to be diversity among the Rebbeim, and because of the diversity among the Talmidim. So these were some of the things. Another thing I remember too, his office is right next to my office. So when he was well, he would often pop in. Sometimes, I myself was pretty busy, but whenever the Rosh Yeshiva wanted to pop in, so he was always a welcome guest. Tell me a joke, a story, an insight. But the amazing thing about him, and this is really quite amazing, is, the amount of traveling he did was unbelievable. He would sometimes go to America 3 times a month. And he worked until the point of exhaustion. And then when he got totally exhausted, he continued to work, beyond the point of exhaustion. And every single problem of this yeshiva was on his shoulders. Every single problem. And yet, I never saw him depressed. I never saw him agitated. I never saw him upset. I mean, he might be upset over a principle, but in terms of overstressed, never saw that. Always joking, always smiling. Because you see, he knew his mission was a good mission. And when you're convinced you're doing the right thing, then even when you're failing, you're succeeding. So the fact that he failed, he didn't get the money he needed, so what? His chiyuv is not to get the money. His chiyuv is to be Isaac in the hishtadlus, to keep a yeshiva going. And he knew he was doing the Ratzon Hashem. So he was always happy. Always happy. And that's a tremendous thing, that a person could be so burdened with so many different sorrows, but in his avodas Hashem, he knows he's doing Hashem's work, so he's b'simcha. So those are things we can learn. Again, the truth of the matter is, these last 3 years, where he was debilitated, and really it's an awful thing. I don't really know all the history here. He started off with, he went in for some back surgery, like disc surgery, whatever it is, which in the normal course of events is a correctable issue. And somehow it just cascaded into one mishap after another mishap. I mean, he was so full of energy and he was so debilitated the last years. But I want you to know that even during those times, maybe you didn't notice it that much, he wasn't here that much, he was still b'simcha. So, in a sense, for those who were able to observe it, the lessons that he taught, he continued to teach, even when he was in a very, very debilitated state. And you have to imagine, I mean, listen, being in the state he was in would be depressing for anybody. But for a person who was so energetic and so active and so involved, to have all of that taken away, that adds to the physical sickness and disability. And yet he was b'simcha. He was b'simcha, giving chizuk to people and the like. So there's a lot that we can learn from such a person. He had as I mentioned, he had a great appreciation for people, and in many, many different ways. He was very close to many different gedolim, Hasidic gedolim, Litvish gedolim, different types of Rosh Yeshivas. And from each person, he took something. Like Pirkei Avos says, Ezeu chacham halomed mikol adam. A wise person learns from everybody. So he was able to learn from every different type of gadol, but not only from gedolim. He knew many different types of balabatim. And he learned from them, and he even knew his share of rogues and unsavory characters. In the course of collecting money, you sometimes encounter cheaters and dishonest people, and he learned from them too, in the negative sense of what you avoid. So he was a person who had a very rich life experience. He was a Rosh Yeshiva, but he had been a secular studies principal. He'd been a fundraiser. He had gone to a number of different yeshivas, meaning he had a kind of a broad life, including sometimes in the non-religious world. So he combined a lot of things. He combined his great knowledge of Torah, his great knowledge of all sorts of secular wisdom, politics and history and philosophy and baseball, high culture and even low culture, Abbott and Costello, whatever it would be. He had a very rich life experience. He learned from every type of experience. And because he had also a very brilliant mind, he was able to extract from all of those experiences lessons. And the thing about his lessons were two things. They were very profound, they were deep, but they were also practical. Now that's interesting. There are people who are practical, but they're not particularly deep. They're just, very practical. Then there are people who are deep, but, they're so deep you don't really know where they're going. And he managed to combine both things. There was a profundity that was able to then be converted into practical direction. So, really a great man in many, many ways. And, for those of us who knew him a little better, he really was kind of like a father figure to us. And I hope that to the degree that you feel that Ohr Somayach is giving you good stuff, I hope you do. Just know that a lot of the good that goes on here is because of him. So even though, you weren't directly connected, but indirectly you are connected because he created the atmosphere that allows the things to go on. And remember, yeshivas could have gone in many different directions. And if the yeshiva went in a certain direction, he was the one that created that direction. So those are some things to think about. And again, thank you for giving me the opportunity. We've had a lot of Espedim, but the truth is, for people like Rav Schiller, you're never really finished. There's always more and more to say about him. Yeah.
So personally, at times, no matter what I'm learning, let's say I'm learning Gemara very hard, I feel like my Yitzchak will attack me and say, why aren't you spending more time on Chumash? Or if I'm learning Chumash, it said, why aren't you spending more on Musa? And so on and so on. How does one combat that feeling and understand that, I'd love to hear what the Rebbe says. What should you be focusing your learning on at certain points in your life? Is it what you're interested in?
Yeah, no, this is a real problem, and it's a serious problem, and it's a very, very common problem. I experienced it myself, and that is the following. One of the Yetzer Haras, I'm just repeating your question, one of the Yetzer Haras that a person faces is not simply the Yetzer Hara. Why are you learning? Why don't you go out and go to Ben Yehuda Street or go to Tel Aviv? That's one Yetzer Hara, but you might be strong enough to fight that. But the Yetzer Hara comes in so many varieties. It's like a virus that mutates into different forms. And that is, it's a Yetzer Hara about learning. Why are you learning Gemara? Do you know Chumash and Rashi? And maybe you should be learning Chumash. When you're learning Chumash, learn Gemara. And then you can never really concentrate into what you're doing because you're always wondering, should you be doing something else at the time? It's a real problem. It's a Yetzer Hara problem. Part of what you need to do, though, is you have to live in the moment, meaning examine your schedule. I'm not saying not to think about this, meaning how do I allocate my time between Chumash and Gemara, let's say. And, make a determination. I'm not saying ignore it. Chumash is very important. But once you have made your schedule, until you sit down and you have a detailed revision of that schedule, which might be, you basically say, this is what I'm doing now. And therefore, I don't think about the other things I could have been doing. If you constantly focus on the alternatives in life, you'll never move anywhere. Because every road you travel, you will always be trapped into thinking about the alternative roads I could have traveled. We have the same thing about davening and learning. It's like when I'm davening, I'm thinking about Gemara. When I'm learning Gemara, maybe I'm not thinking about Gemara. It's like when I'm davening is when, it's kind of a humorous remark that they attribute to the Chassam Sofer. Rav Yochanan says, it would be a wonderful thing if people would daven the whole day. So frek the Chassam Sofer, how could Rav Yochanan say it would be a wonderful thing to daven the whole day? When are you going to learn? So the Chassam Sofer says, if people would daven the whole day, they would do plenty of learning, because that's when we want to learn most, is during davening. So Mamela, daven the whole day, you'll get in your 6 hours of learning. Masha'en Kain, if you wouldn't be davening, so then my desire to learn is not so strong. But don't forget those points. So really the issue is, it does take a certain discipline, and it basically says, I am in this moment. It's called mindfulness. And I will try to savor the experience of this moment and not to think about others. Now, this requires work, but eventually it can become more habitual. These are the types of things that you can eventually train yourself in a more disciplined, focused way to deal with what you are doing right now. In fact, this is true with everything. This is true with family time, right? You're with your family, you're with your children, and you're thinking about what I should be doing there. Then I'm in shul, and I'm thinking about I should be with my family. I'm with my family, I'm thinking I should be learning. Right? So there is a concept that you gotta focus on the moment and savor this moment and utilize this moment for what it represents. And B'ezras Hashem, you will have hatzlacha in that way. Yeah.
How did we lose certain Mesoras for certain things and branch out to different minhagim? For example, tefillin. Why didn't they just see what their forefathers did, their parents did?
Yeah. So, you talk about minhagim, which means customs, they can develop geographically because these were ways of enhancing mitzvahs. But your particular example of tefillin is a real hard one. We know that, actually there are more than two. I'm just going to mention two, but there are more than two shittas about tefillin. But the primary two shittas about tefillin that are best known is the machlokas between Rashi, a normal pair of tefillin follows Rashi's shita, versus Rabbeinu Tam, who's Rashi's own grandson. And this is simply the organization, the order of the 4 parshios in the head tefillin. Yad, right? The order of the parshios. Does it go in chronological order, or is there another arrangement? Now, the problem with this is the following. Rashi lived in the 1100s, and Rabbeinu Tam lived a little later, although his life overlapped with Rashi. And this is 2,000 years after Matan Torah, and Jews have been wearing tefillin ever since Har Sinai, if not earlier. So what? Rabbeinu Tam got up one day and just declared that all of the tefillin that existed in the world are just puzzle, and you got to do it this way. And it's not just a question of different minhagim, because according to Rabbeinu Tam, if you wear Rashi's tefillin, you're not yotzei the mitzvah. And according to Rashi, if you wore Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin, you're not yotzei the mitzvah. So how do you get a machlokas in the Middle Ages about a practice that had already been going on for thousands of years? What did the predecessor generations do? So it is a bit of a mystery, but I mean, the answer that's given is, this will not be a complete answer, but obviously Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam didn't originate these two different views, but rather the machlokas goes back way, 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 way back. And although a majority followed Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam basically tries to prove from different sources that the minority view was the more halachically proper one. So this answers part of the question. It doesn't answer all of the question. It answers the question, well, how could you have a machlokas that emerges in the 1100s and 1200s about how to write tefillin? So the answer is it didn't emerge then. It goes all the way back. But you still have a problem. But how did it possibly start? Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Moshe the details of the mitzvah of tefillin. Presumably in Moshe Rabbeinu's time, they didn't wear different tefillin, right? The tefillin was all whatever it was, either Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam, let's say. There are other shittas as well. So how does a machlokas originate? How does an uncertainty arise in something that people are doing all day, every day? Then it was all day, but even today it's every day except Shabbos. So it is a bit of a mystery, but one of the answers that's given is that for various reasons, there were communities in Klal Yisrael where very few people wore tefillin, and perhaps didn't wear tefillin at all. Because technically, tefillin has very severe halachas about bodily purity, hygiene, and the like, that if a person has flatulence problems or different digestive problems, they actually don't wear tefillin. So these halachas still apply to us, but we're a little more liberal because we don't wear it the whole day, so we only wear it for a short time. But there were communities in which people very rarely wore tefillin. And in a community where people very rarely wore tefillin, it's possible to forget. There is a certain aspect of forgetfulness that can be introduced into the equation. And forgetfulness eventually can concretize into two different shitos, for which there will be a machlokas. But I can't give you the exact date of how early that uncertainty was. But it was much, much earlier than Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, that's for sure. Because it's impossible to say that until Rabbeinu Tam, all tefillin was one way, and Rabbeinu Tam says it's puzzle. So you're dealing with uncertainty primarily because of the lack of widespread observance of the mitzvah of tefillin. They tell, it's recorded in Mesoras. Who knows if it's true? I doubt if it's true. But when Rabbeinu Tam was a little baby, sitting on his Zaydi's lap, right? Rashi is Rabbeinu Tam's Zaydi, and Rashi wore tefillin the whole day. So they say Rabbeinu Tam, baby Rabbeinu Tam, used to pull off the tefillin from Rashi's head, and they say, that's a siman min hashamayim that he's going to differ with. His grandfather on the mitzvah of tefillin. Yeah.
Aside from making sure that we find the right woman who's very strong in her Yidishkeit, does the Rav have any tips for raising children that are very strong in their Yidishkeit, and also why there's some kids that tend to go off the derech despite their parents being very good people and being very strong, doing everything that they can do, what to do and basically what to avoid?
Yeah, let me just mention the last thing first, the issue of parents who are wonderful parents, parents who are from, parents who are committed, and yet we still have the phenomenon of what are called either kids at risk or off the derech, in which kids from homes may wander off and leave the derech HaTorah. Sometimes, thank God, it's only temporary and they come back. Other times, unfortunately, it may be for good. And you wonder, how does that happen? Now, naturally, a parent's inclination is to blame themselves, that we did something wrong. And sometimes there may be a cheshbon hanefesh there. But it's important that parents not always assume that they're at fault. I mean, human beings do have free will. And sometimes people exercise their free will in a different way. So obviously a parent is going to be very, very sad and heartbroken, but guilty is not necessarily the appropriate response. Sometimes parents are guilty of nothing, but nevertheless, bechira has its function. Now that's a scary thing, because that basically says no matter what you do, there's no guarantees, right? So that's one thing to be aware of. But in terms of how do you create the greatest probabilities of raising children that are going to be strong and stark, so I would say this. I would say that, number one, you try to create an atmosphere of simcha in avodas Hashem. Meaning, if Yidishkeit is considered to be a burden, sometimes you have a from person. Who's from? He's keeping all the mitzvahs. But everything is a burden. Oh, we got to clean for Pesach. You got to do this for Shabbos. If a kid is hearing like negativities, a kid is hearing gripes, a kid is hearing that everything is a burden, everything is a tircha, then at some point the kid might say to himself, well, it's a free country. Why do I have to live my life with a sense of burden if I could have a free life without any of these responsibilities? So Rav Moshe Feinstein used to say that the old Yiddish saying, "It's schwer zu sein a Yid," it's hard to be a Jew. It's an old Yiddish saying. He says was a very negative saying, because if you convey the message, it's hard to be a Jew, then a kid might say, well, so why should I be a Jew? Why should I live in a hard way? So I think first and foremost, you try to create positivity, you try to create simcha, you try to create enthusiasm. A second point is you make time to spend with your children. Sometimes a child sees frumkeit as almost an enemy of developing a good relationship with his father or mother, because the kid sees that Abba always is going to this and going to that, and there's no time for me. Now, I understand if a person is an avrech, a person is learning, a person's a rebbe, of course you have to devote yourself to Torah learning, just as a person with a job devotes himself to a job. But there still should be special time that you make for your children, that the children should not feel they're neglected, they should not feel second rate, they should not feel that they don't matter. They should feel that they're very treasured in their parents' eyes. And that's a very important thing. So it's the simcha in avodas Hashem. It's the notion of making special time to be with your child. In fact, I heard a beautiful story about Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, Zichrono Livracha. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with him. He was the son-in-law of Rav Soloveitchik of YU, and he was a very, very prominent Rosh Yeshiva in Dati Liumi, Rosh Yeshiva of Gush Etzion. So in the Haredi world, people don't talk about him that much, but he was an Adam Gadol. He also had a PhD in English literature from Harvard University, but he was a big Talmud Chacham. I mean, he knew Shas and Rambam. He knew a lot more Torah than many people know. And he used to live in Katamon. Now, Katamon, if you know the neighborhoods here, Katamon has a famous shtibel that has non-stop minyanim, one after the other. And he used to learn Motzei Shabbos. He would learn with his son in the Katamon shtiblach. So somebody went over to him and said, Rosh Yeshiva, I'm so impressed that even though you run a big yeshiva, you make time to learn with your son. So Rav Lichtenstein responded, I don't know what you mean, make time to learn with my son. My primary obligation is Vishinantam Levanecha, to teach my son. I make time to run a big yeshiva in addition, meaning instead of saying, my job is to run a yeshiva, but I also learn with my son, there's a certain mindset. My job is to learn with my son, and then I make time for other things too. I know that sounds semantics, but I think that shows a certain type of attitude. A third thing, so I mentioned simcha, I mentioned spending time, developing a relationship with your son. And that may mean even activities that are not pure Torahic. Again, living in the Haredi world in Eretz Yisrael is a little more complicated, but there was a picture, it actually made the newspapers. Do you know Rabbi Leff? You've heard of Rabbi Leff? He's the Rav of Moshe Montesio. He was an American rabbi, but now he's been in Eretz Yisrael for many years, and he's one of the Chashuva American Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael. He teaches here in Ohr Somayach too. So there's a picture of him with his grandson at a soccer game. And he has a Gemara. It's a great picture. He has a Gemara with him, so he's not watching the game. He's learning Gemara, and they actually took a picture of him learning Gemara while they're playing soccer. So he's learning Gemara, but he took his grandson to the soccer game. He could have said, I don't go to soccer games, and he could have told the grandson, you don't go to soccer games. He says, no, the kid wanted to go to soccer, so I'll take him to soccer. I mean, I don't want to compare myself, but I had similar, when my son used to play basketball in his modern Orthodox day school. So I went to all the games because and I sat and I have to say I wasn't as good as Rabbi Leff. I didn't even always bring a Gemara. I sometimes just watched the game because if it's important to your kid, it should be important to you. And the point I'm making is when your child feels you're there for him, he'll want to make you happy. Now, I understand that that's shalom lishma because ultimately we don't do mitzvahs. All right, I don't do mitzvahs because it makes my father happy. I do mitzvahs because of Hashem. But l'maisa, that is a big motivator, meaning if I can make my father happy and I know how much he loves me, I'm going to try to make my father happy. And that is actually a way of keeping kids in the derech. And then we, as Chazal say, mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma, even though that's not lishma, eventually it brings them lishma. And that also means appreciate the individuality of your child. If he's interested in science, interested in music, interested in sports, find ways to incorporate it within a religious lifestyle, that he shouldn't feel that he has to be cut off from those things that he enjoys. Okay, don't be too tough. In the Evan Shlema, the Vilna Gaon's writings. Now, granted, the Vilna Gaon did not come from a culture that even knew basketball, football, baseball. He doesn't talk in those specific terms. Those things weren't even invented yet. But he does say, when you're raising your child, do it in a gentle, gradual way. Do not put too much on the kid. You put too much on a kid, you break him. And when you break him, he will resent it. And even though when he's young, perhaps he's under your control, so you can force him, although that doesn't work today either, but you can force him. When he gets older, you're not going to be able to force him. And he's going to leave it. So you got to be gentle, you got to be responsive, you got to be attuned to what he needs. So I think if you do all of the different things I mentioned, I think, and of course, the final thing is daven. Daven to Hashem for siyata d'shmaya. And never forget, you need tefillah. But if you do all of those things, and particularly if you combine it with tefillah, then at least you have a good probability of things working out well. There's no guarantees. People are bali b'chira. But you've created the environment that's most likely to breed success. Okay, so don't put a lot of pressure on your kids. Let them be children. I remember I was once, maybe I shouldn't say this, I was once walking with Rav Bolman, Zichrono Livracha. You heard of Rav Bolman? His picture. Rav Bolman was also a great, phenomenally successful rabbi and kiruv rav in the United States, and he came to Eretz Yisrael, and he created a wonderful community up north near Haifa, which unfortunately folded because of financial reasons, but people who lived up there with him for a few years still talk about it as a transformative experience. He was really heartbroken when it folded, but then he came to Ohr Somayach, and he was kind of the mashgiach in Ohr Somayach, a great person. And I was once walking with him, and we were walking somewhere in Yerushalayim, and he saw like guys wearing backpacks or whatever kind of informal dress. And he said, this informal stuff is good. It relaxes people. It takes away their tension. And when it takes away their tension, they're more receptive to raĥmeis because it doesn't make them uptight and anxious. And he said we really should try to avoid the anxiety and the nervousness and the tension. We should try to cultivate. When I say relaxed, I don't mean complacent. I don't mean complacent. I don't mean like, anything goes. But there's a certain lightness. In fact, somebody once told me about their father. This was, again, I'm mentioning a lot of names today that some of you might know, some of you might not know. You guys know Rav Naftali Kaplan, not Rav David Kaplan. Rav Naftali Kaplan is in his 90s. He's like one of the senior Balei Musar Mashgichim in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Naftali Kaplan, who also had taught in Ohr Somayach for a long time. The truth is, I know Rav Naftali Kaplan for many, many, many years. He used to be a Rebbe in Ner Yisrael, and when I was in 6th grade and I visited Ner Yisrael, he was already teaching in the high school, so I don't think he knew me then, but I knew him from then. Rav Naftali Kaplan. And his son is Rav Nissen Kaplan, who was a Rashiva in Mir and now started his own yeshiva. So he has sons and grandchildren who are big Talmidei Chachamim. So I think Rav Nissen Kaplan once said about his father, someone asked him, your father has so many different yeshivas that he runs, because he's like a Baal Musar for many yeshivas. Like, what does he do to relieve his tension? What does he do when, things are nerve-wracking? He says, he pulls out a Gemara and learns. Now, that's a very charming statement that maybe many of us wouldn't automatically look at it that way. Learning can be relaxing, therapeutic, calming, as opposed to the idea that it's anxiety-producing. But that's a beautiful thing, that your Yiras Hashem actually becomes something that feeds you, that nourishes you. Now the Kuzari, much, much earlier, the Kuzari says it about davening. He says, davening is the food of the soul, just like the body takes nutrition 3 times a day. The soul gets its nutrition by its conversation with Hashem 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, night. And he says, davening should be the most delightful, pleasurable part of the day. Geschmack. Now again, every person is different. But, for many, many people, davening, I gotta do it, as opposed to the pleasure. So, if we could make that a pleasure to our kids, that's a great thing. But you know what the big problem is? The big problem with that is that, you can't really make it a pleasure to your kid until it's a pleasure to you. People are always asking, how do I get my child to love Torah? The answer is, when you love Torah, your child will love Torah. Meaning, everybody wants to make the child into the tzaddik of the generation. But the truth is, it got to start with you, you see? So, I don't know if I answered your question, but these are some things to think about very much. I also feel, that's not an opinion. I think that, at least if you're going to be in Chutz La'aretz, I think there's a real advantage in living what is called out of town, meaning in town are the major Jewish centers like New York, Brooklyn, Muncie, Lakewood. Out of town are Milwaukee, Chicago, the places that are a little less developed. Or like my case, Hartford, Connecticut, I talk about a lot. And those are called out of town, which is like a semi-pejorative term. Oh, he's out of town, like you're a hillbilly from Appalachia or whatever. But I think when you're choosing a place to live, I think out of town has some real strengths. because life is generally at a lower level of pressure, and that's very conducive to spiritual growth. And you don't have this pressure of keeping up with the Joneses, either in Ruchnius or in Gashmias. So I think out of town has some real strengths in that way. And also, I'll tell you another thing about out of town. Out of town, a kid can have a sense that he really matters. By that I mean the following. A typical shul out of town may have difficulty getting a minyan. So your bar mitzvah boy can make the minyan. In other words, he's needed. In a very well-established, they don't need you for anything. There's like 200 where you're coming from, So one of the strengths of out-of-town kids is they take on responsibilities younger, because they're just needed to do things. You don't have this unlimited number of people who will take care of what needs to be taken care of. And I think that develops stronger characters, stronger Jewish commitments in many ways. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
From the largest raffle, like the ultimate prize for Chinese selection, to the smallest raffle, how much is Hashem involved in these things?
Yeah. Does Hashem determine who wins raffles? Our assumption this is really a part of a huge question about the role of what is called hashgacha pratis. Right? Hashgacha pratis is translated typically as divine providence, that God determines everything that happens to you. So what is this? Do we believe that? Do we believe if I miss my bus, it was God who decreed that you would miss the bus? Or if the bus goes through a puddle and you get splashed, did Hashem specifically say at 9:09 you're going to get mud on your pants? Or no, is it kind of, nature happens and things happen and the like. So in truth, there's a big machlokas. Let me start with what you might call the mainstream opinion. The mainstream view, which is really from the Chovas Halavavos, and was taken over by the Mekubalim and Hasidus, and I would call that the mainstream view of Judaism, although it was not originally the mainstream view, is that everything that happens to you, from the biggest thing to the smallest thing, is Hashem is decreeing that this is supposed to happen to you at this exact moment. Now, granted, there are exceptions when, your decision to do mitzvahs or averos is not God's decision, it's your decision. But even then, the result and consequences that will flow from your bechira are specifically decreed by God. Right? In other words, even though the underlying action may be your action, but the consequence is decreed by God. So this is what we'll call the micromanagement idea of hashgacha, that everything is specifically decreed by God. Ad kedei kach that the Chovas Halevavos actually says, Chovas Halevavos famously says, that no person has any power to harm another person unless God decreed that that person is supposed to be harmed at that time. Now this is quite remarkable, because let's apply that statement to the Holocaust for a moment. Okay, Holocaust, Nazis and their collaborators, Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians, whoever it is, they murdered 6 million Jews, let's say, between 1941 and 1945. Okay? Now, the Chovas Halevavos says that even though the Nazis chose to do their evil, they wouldn't have been able to kill a single Jew unless God decreed that these people are going to die. Now, why God decrees, the Chovas Halevavos doesn't say. It might be Averis, it might be for other reasons, meaning we're not saying they deserve to die in that sense. Don't confuse that. We're not going there. But we're simply saying there must have been a decree on each one of those 6 million. Now, that creates an astounding problem. Because did Hitler have bechira not to kill, like Paro? The answer is surely he did. So what would have been if Hitler and the Nazis would have decided they would have done tshuva and not killed Jews, according to the Chovos HaLevavos, 6 million people would have dropped dead anyway. The 6 million Jews didn't die because Hitler killed them. The 6 million Jews died because Hashem decreed that 6 million Jews will die, and since Hitler made the Bechira, so Hashem let Hitler be the vehicle. I mean, that's pretty astounding. Meaning, had there not been Nazi Germany, they would have died anyway? This is the position of the Chovos HaLevavos, based on his understanding of Hashgacha Pratis. Nothing happens unless it's decreed by God. Now, the truth is, Rav Dessler modifies it somewhat in a way that I think is very, very meaningful. Rav Dessler says, well, Hashgacha Pratis doesn't have to be a specific outcome. You die, you live. Sometimes Hashem's Hashgacha is, I deliver you into the ambit of Bechira of another person. Meaning, now this already is easier to grasp in the Chovos HaLevavos. It's not that God decreed that 6 million Jews. In other words, without Rav Dessler, there are two possibilities here. The micromanagement school of Hashgacha Pratis would say, every single person who died is because God decreed they are supposed to die. And even without Hitler, they would have died. That's the maximum school. The opposite school, which some say is heretical, but there is such a shita, says, no, who says God wanted them to die? Rather, what happened was, Hitler are Balei Bechira, and since they make choices, they can wreak havoc. Meaning God was not involved. God didn't stop it, but God was not involved. Rav Dessler has an intermediate view that actually makes a lot of sense. Rav Dessler's view is that sometimes God's gezerah, God's decree, is not that you will die, but you will be subject to the free will of this other person. So if the Nazis do tshuva, maybe you won't die. If the Nazis don't do tshuva, you will be caught up in their bechira. Now that's not abandoning hashgacha. That's not saying God was not involved, but it's saying God's decision was to be moser you to the bechira. Right? So that's the Holocaust. But going back to lottery, so if you go with the Chovos HaLevavos, it turns out the result in a lottery is certainly determined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, if you go with the Rambam, however, the shita of the Rambam is the following. And maybe I shouldn't call it the shita of the Rambam because there's a lot of controversy if that is the shita of the Rambam. In fact, Rav Gottlieb has a lot of shiurim on this. But the pashtus of the Rambam, I'll call it the pashtus of the Rambam. And please don't write me. I know there's a shaila about if that's the Rambam shita. Is that hashgacha pratis is not a universal principle. It only applies to the righteous, or it applies episodically when you turn to God in prayer, and God will answer your prayer. But in the normal course of life, the way the Rambam understands it, for normal people, things can happen because, nature has a certain course. So if I get my pants, if I get muddy water on my pants because a bus goes by, according to the Rambam, at least the pashas of the Rambam, Hashem did not decree that your pants get muddy at that moment. It's simply the fact that when a bus, goes into a puddle, there's a splash, and you happen to be there, so you get it. In other words, it's not a hashgacha pratis thing. So according to the Rambam, the same logic might apply to lotteries. So I would basically say that your question is a very far-reaching question about the nature of hashgacha pratis. Now, I do want to emphasize one very important point, because God forbid you could walk away with a very, very wrong conclusion. If according to the Rambam, not everything that happens to me is decreed by God, but it's simply kind of, nature, wrong time, wrong place, wrong time. I happen to be in a place when there's a volcano, which comes because of natural reasons, right? So you might figure that things just happen. They're nature. They're teva. So the question becomes, so why daven? Bishlama, if Hashem is decreeing everything on me, so I ask God to change the decree. All right? But if things happen because just of nature and God is not decreeing those things, what is the tachlis of davening? But the short answer is, that's why I said it, that the Rambam is moda that Hashem can intervene at any second. Meaning, if bad things happen to me, maybe there was no gezerah that bad things would happen to me. It just means I was left to teva. But I could pray that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should relate to me in a way that extricates me. So again, I need to make the very, very important point that the Rambam is not negating the chashivas of tefillah and the fact that tefillah can extricate you from a tzara. Now the truth is, there are contradictions in the Rambam. On one hand, the Rambam seems to say hashgacha pratis is only for tzaddikim, it's not for average people. And yet the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah in Hilchos Tainus says that whenever we see tragedies happening in the world, we need to understand they are not mikra, they are not happenstance, they are not coincidence, but they are messages sent from God. Now that seems to be a very specific hashgacha pratis type of thing, but then you can make subtle chilukim. Maybe there's a difference between the general message and the specific victim that is affected, meaning God decrees the tsunami to teach the world a lesson, but God is not necessarily decreeing who will be the specific person that's going to be harmed, right? So it's not an all or nothing. There is what you might call hashgacha kalalis, even if it doesn't translate into hashgacha pratis. So this is a very, very, the truth is your question is actually a very, very complex question, and it goes to the how detailed is Hashem's hashgacha pratis in all pratim. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
I know this might get a little complicated, but so the Rambam brings a raya from this in Breitowitz from Yosef telling his brothers, it wasn't you guys that brought me to Mitzrayim, it was Hashem. So
Yeah.
I don't understand, according to the Rambam, what is Yosef really telling his brothers? If it's not really up to Hashem and it really was their own
Well, I mean, the short answer is, remember, the Rambam is moda when you have tzaddikim. Tzaddikim live with hashgachas pratis. So Yosef HaTzadik, everything that happened in his life was dictated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Rambam is moda to that. That's exactly the case of the exception that proves the rule. The Rambam is simply saying, hashgacha pratis is the level of the tzaddik, and it's not necessarily the level that each and every one of us are on. Now, as I say, mainstream Kabbalah and Hasidus do reject that view, and the Rambam's, or at least the apparent pshat of the Rambam, is not the mainstream position in Klal Yisrael, where we say everything is hashgacha pratis. By the way, another little thing I want to point out is, and actually your citation of Yosef proves the point, people always assume hashgacha pratis means it's going to be a good outcome. No, I mean, hashgacha pratis could mean someone dies too. In other words, hashgacha pratis doesn't mean God's going to protect you. Divine providence is not the same as divine protection. That's another thing. Divine protection, that's another thing. But divine providence simply means HaKadosh Baruch Hu directly made a decision about you as an individual. That could be good, that could be bad, right? It doesn't mean it'll automatically be good, but it was a directed, targeted decision for you. Yeah.
Why is it so hard to find healthy family relationships within Tanach?
Yeah. So I would, it is a good point. I mean, a lot of things in Tanakh are dysfunctional. Part of it is the following. Part of it is that Tanakh records maybe even the atypical events to teach you certain fundamental principles. So sometimes we have to talk about the dysfunctional to kind of analyze what needs to be fixed. Because we have so many dysfunctions in our lives, and we can learn from Tanach about all of these chesronos. But they don't necessarily refer to what was typical. Rav Victor Miller writes, although some argue with him on this, if you read Nach generally, putting aside family, you're raising the family issue, but it seems like everybody was Oved Avodah Zarah, everybody was doing Gilui Arayos, everybody was doing Shvichas Damim, everybody was doing Averis all the time. So Rav Miller claims, again he has some sources for it, that at no time was there ever a majority of the Jewish people not keeping the Torah. That's a modern phenomenon. Most of the Jews kept the Torah. But because of the principle of Kol Yisrael Arev and Zelazah, each Jew is responsible, so it describes it as if the whole nation is sinning, even if it was a relatively small minority. So still, however, Tanakh describes it as the people are sinning. So the notion is that because of that communal responsibility, things are portrayed in a more sordid manner than would actually correspond with the reality. It's a pedagogical device. It's a way of making you focus on the chesronos so you'll know how to build and fix and be masakin. Yeah.
Hashem, at a sort of crucial point, after Yaakov chose sort of that his sons would be the seedbed of the nation, and even though today that is that they view themselves as separate nations, Hashem wanted Klal Yisrael to be represented by this multiplicity of 12. It was like a particular structure. What can we say as to why that structure faded out? Like it's essentially become irrelevant. We're either Yehuda or Levi, and nobody thinks of themselves as like any of these other tribes that Hashem put a lot of effort to sort of like make things flow, that they would constitute the nation of Israel. So what happened? Why did the plan?
Yeah, it is a good question. Let's first talk about the ideal situation. The ideal situation is the 12 tribes. 13 tribes if you count Levi. Again, and there are two different ways the 12 tribes are counted, just to be sure that you understand it. Sometimes we don't count Levi, and we divide Yosef into Ephraim and Manasseh. That's how you get 12. Sometimes we count Levi, and Ephraim and Manasseh are counted as Shevet Yosef, like on the Choshen, and that's how you get 12, right? So technically you have 13 tribes, but you count 12 either by excluding Levi or by combining Ephraim and Manasseh into Yosef. But it's very, very clear, as you pointed out, that tribes are a big deal. Hashem didn't just want to create a Jewish people. He wanted to create a Jewish people that is comprised of 12 tribes. Now, separate land, separate Nisim, separate stones on the Choshen. Right? This was a big deal. The question becomes, why is that important? I mean, I understand why you have to have Kohanim or Levi. Okay, but let there be Levi and everybody else, just like here. Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, exactly what we have today. What was it in God's original optimal plan that wanted all of these tribes? Isn't it enough that you're Jewish? Mm-hmm. We have to introduce another cause of fighting. Oh, I'm Yisachar, you're Zebulun. So the short answer is there's a very profound lesson. And the profound lesson is that Hashem, similar to what I spoke about with Rav Schiller, Zechrono Livracha, Hashem did not want a unity where everybody's the same. He didn't want a homogeneity. He wanted a unity that involved different types of abilities, different types of talents, different types of kochos. Kind of a unity that is predicated on diversity and difference and a different approach in Avodas Hashem. We don't have a clear grasp of how the approaches were totally different, but this is the basic idea, that each Shevet had a unique mahalech in its Avodas Hashem. And the lesson, therefore, was that you need a unity that is not cookie cutter, it's not conformity, but a unity that appreciates the diversity. And that's a lesson not only for tribes, that's also a lesson legabe individuals within the community as well. We sometimes don't pay attention to that. Now the question then becomes, well, gee, this beautiful structure, as you say, disappears. with the Churban, essentially the Churban of the first temple, not even the second temple. We no longer have any particular emphasis on tribes. Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, whatever tribe you are, Yisrael. And by the way, you could be a member of any tribe, not just Judah and Binyamin, because there were remnants of the 10 tribes. So it could be, it's a very good question, but it could be that when you're living in times of galus, in times of persecution, you gotta sometimes put aside your individuality and work for a common good. Meaning when you're in your land and you're secure and you have a Beis HaMikdash, you have the luxury to focus on individuality. But when you're beleaguered, maybe you need to de-emphasize it a little bit. I mean, that would actually explain kind of the Haredi world's homogeneity, right? The black and white or whatever it is. Why does everybody have to dress the same? I'm not defending it, but I'm just saying, but maybe the argument is, when you live in a world that is attacking what you stand for, maybe you need to have a little bit more of a united front than you would need when you're in a greater position of strength. So that might be part of what's going on. Okay, we'll take one more and then we'll stop. Yeah, two more. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
The Rav mentioned. One second, sorry. Here we go. I remember the Rav said that a while ago in an old Q&A, they used to spend time proving to people that God exists, but doesn't do so anymore, for various reasons. So just out of curiosity, when the Rav used to do this, which approaches did the Rav used to take?
Oh, you're talking about what I used to do? Oh.
So for example, that and there's the historical proofs, the rationalistic proofs, like the Rav, the rationalistic proofs, the proofs of just.
Well, I tell you, I still do it occasionally. It's not that I didn't totally retire from it. Well, I would do a few things. I would talk about number one, Jewish survival as a great miracle because it defies the laws of history. Arnold Toynbee was a very famous British historian, and he wrote a massive work called A Study in History, which he analyzed, I think, 50 ancient civilizations, their rise, their fall, and he was able to chart a common basis for how civilizations flourish and when they die. But out of the 50 civilizations he looked at, the one thing that didn't fit the paradigm was the Jewish people. Logically, there shouldn't be a Jewish people because for most of our history, we didn't have common territory and we didn't even share a common language. And as a result, he treated the he was anti-Semitic, but he treated the Jewish people as a fossil. He called them a fossil. It's like finding a dinosaur in whatever it is. Now, that was a big debate, the Herzog-Toynbee debate. You can see it on YouTube, a very famous debate in the 1960s. But the truth of the matter is, I believe Toynbee is right. Because if Toynbee is claiming that based on history, there ought not to be a Jewish people, my answer is, yeah, 100% correct. Jewish survival is a miracle. And it cannot be explained derech hateva. Right? There ought not to be Jews at all, based on the historical circumstances that we found ourselves. So that's one aspect. Another aspect I think that's very important is that the deeper you delve into science, it's interesting, there are many scientists, obviously, who are atheists. But if you think about it, they do their work as if they did believe in God. Because what does a scientist seek? A scientist tries to seek coherence, order, structure. A scientist seeks to explain many phenomena by connecting it to one or a few basic principles. Physics presently is based on 4 elemental forces: electromagnetism, gravity, and what they call strong force and weak force, which is an amazing thing. That explains billions of phenomena. And, forgive me for using a Christian metaphor, but the holy grail of physics is to look for a unified field theory, which is called TOE, TOE, theory of everything, Einstein spent 30 years for this. Einstein didn't reach it, but Einstein was convinced there would be a unified idea. Now, if you don't believe in God, then why would there even be something like that? If there's no conscious creator, then whatever you say, things happen because things happen. Why would there be? Who would be giving coherence? Who would be giving direction? Who would be giving structure? And yet, the very elegance of the structure of the universe gives proof that there's a God. That's why Einstein, who was not a religious Jew at all, although around 12 years old, he flirted with Orthodox Judaism, actually. He was like frum for half a year. Before his bar mitzvah, unfortunately. But Einstein did not believe in the God who gives you commandments. That's true. But he very much believed in the God who created the architecture of the universe. Okay, so that I think is a strong argument. Another point I would make is morality and altruism. Because here's the problem. The problem is we have something called conscience. Unless you're psychotic or a sociopath, most people feel it's wrong to kill, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to do things that harm people. What is the basis of morality? Now, Thomas Hobbes, who was a British political philosopher, had this problem because he didn't believe in God, but why do human beings have morality? Meaning, if I want your sneakers, why shouldn't I kill you if I don't believe in God? Right? Dostoevsky wrote in Crime and Punishment, without God, everything is mutter, everything's permitted. So Hobbes tried to develop a non-theistic theory of morality based on self-preservation. This is what he says. He says, listen, the one thing I want is I want to live. So if I can go around killing people because I want their sneakers, people can go around killing me because they want my sneakers. So it's kind of a social agreement where, okay, I'm not going to kill you because that way, you're not going to try to kill me. In other words, he grounded morality not in altruism. He grounded morality in self-preservation. That was Hobbes' teretz to how do you get morality without God. But the problem I have is this. What happens when people make moral decisions that contradict their need for self-preservation? What about the German or the Polish family who hid a Jew, knowing that if they would get caught, they would be killed? Yeah, there weren't that many of them, but okay, Beseda, but there were some. These are the righteous Gentiles. What about the person who gives his life for his children, for his country? In other words, where is that coming from? In other words, the idea of doing moral things to help other people. Not because it enhances your self-preservation, but it endangers your self-preservation. So I'm not saying it's a proof, but some would say that this suggests that Hashem has implanted in a divine soul morality and goodness and intuitive truth. So the 3 points I would make very briefly is I would make, number one, the miracle of Jewish survival. Number two, the elegance, unity, and coherence of the natural order. And number three, the source of altruistic self-sacrifice and morality. And I think together they combine to make a case for the existence of God. Yeah.
I noticed that the Rav didn't bring the Kuzari's proof of Har Sinai. There's unbroken chains. The only religion that makes such a claim in the history of the world. Is there a reason for the Rav didn't bring that?
Well, no. Well, again, the Kuzari. Okay, you're actually correct. I mean, the Kuzari was not using this as proof of God. He was using this as proof of Matan Torah. But the truth is, you're right. If you're proving Matan Torah, then by definition that presupposes there was a God that gave the Torah. I mentioned the Kuzari proof. The truth is, the last thing I want to do is, I don't want to make anybody skeptical about the Kuzari proof, but the Kuzari proof is a little more problematical. There are kashas on some aspects of the Kuzari's proof. But the truth of the matter is, though, for what you want to use it for, it actually is quite strong. Meaning, the Kuzari's proof is weakest with respect to the content of the Torah. Let me tell you why. Because the Kuzari says mass revelation is not something you could fabricate. And therefore, we have this unbroken tradition. But here's the problem here. Most of the Torah we did not get through mass revelation. We only got either the first 2 commandments or the 10 commandments at most. So more than 600 commandments, we heard it from Moshe Rabbeinu. So the question you could ask is, even if the Kuzari's proof is a very good proof that there was an experience of mass revelation, that is not a proof that establishes the truth of the whole Torah coming from God. But in showing that there is God, actually, what you were using it for, it actually is a good proof. It is stronger. What the Kuzari used it for, I think, is a little problematical, because it doesn't really validate the entire Torah as coming from God. Yeah.
Because of mass revelation, which was witnessed, therefore that's, there's an unbroken chain, right?
Yeah.
What if someone tries to argue against that by making the following point? So how do you respond to this counter argument? Really the Torah was really given to the Jewish people many centuries later by a group of priests, and they had to make the argument that it was actually originated at Sinai by their ancestors, but somehow they forgot it because they stopped the chain. So we have to now move it back to you, and then there was essentially a mass conversion to religion. They have to create a national origin myth to it.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah. Obviously, those who are skeptical will say exactly what you're saying. The Kuzari argues that is inherently a very improbable story, because if I make a claim to you that God spoke to 3 million of your ancestors, but it got forgotten, you're going to say, well, listen, how do millions of people forget something? Mass amnesia. Aliens from outer space sprayed them with a forgetfulness spray. So it goes back to probability, meaning it's not a probabilistic argument that something that had so many millions of people heard would have been forgotten, and therefore the notion that it was made up is not logical. Now, the problem is, though, and this is a big problem, that there actually appears to be incidents in Nach where that very thing happened. For example, during King Yoshio's reign, they found a Torah that they weren't even aware of, meaning it almost seems as if Judaism was forgotten when they found that Torah. So when they found that Torah, the priests had to say exactly what you're saying. So the truth is, we have different interpretations. According to at least rabbinic interpretation, when they say they found a Torah, that doesn't mean Judaism was forgotten. Rather, the Torah was open to a particular passage about the Tochacha, and that was its significance. There was no concept that the religion was forgotten and then reconstructed. Because you're right, the whole Kuzari's argument is it couldn't have been reconstructed after being totally forgotten, because that wouldn't have been credible and that wouldn't have been accepted. That would have been a claim that would have been regarded as too fantastic. And the like. But the reason why, just to go back to your question directly, the reason why I said, I don't remember when I said it, why I stopped talking about proofs is more of a pragmatic concern. And that is that basically it never changes anybody's mind. That's the issue. People come in and you show them this proof and that proof, and then, well, maybe it was this and maybe it was that. Like Rabbi Gottlieb says, maybe the moon is green cheese. Prove that it's not. At least most of us, we were never there. We're not able to prove it. So the idea was that no matter what type of argument you make, the skeptic can always not go with it. So to me, the main things that keep people from Yiddishkeit are not proof discussions, but various emotional issues that need to be addressed. So as a result, it's funny, people think Ohr Somayach is the place, oh, you want to know about proof for God, come to Ohr Somayach. I get these calls all the time. My son is 15 years old, he doesn't believe in Hashem anymore, can he come talk to you? And I sometimes say no. I say, I'll talk to your son about problems he's facing in life, but I'm not going to get into a debate with a teenager to try to prove him about God. I mean, there are videos, there are YouTube videos, there are shiurim you can do, but to simply talk for 2 hours, when I know ahead of time that after the 2 hours, it'll still be, well, how do you know? It's not a good investment of time, other than the indirect idea that the fact that you spend 2 hours with him, this is interesting, it's nothing to do with what you say. What you say, you'll say, how do you? But the fact that a rabbi spent 2 hours with him, that actually might make a difference. And for that, it may be kedai to do, but not for the substance of the argument. So I don't find it a productive avenue. Yeah.
You Rav give some advice on how to prepare for Pesach and Mesoras?
Yeah, so this is a hard one because, if you're single, maybe it's not the same thing, but Pesach has a lot of physical preparation, cleaning the house and getting rid of all of the chametz, and it's very, very exhausting, particularly women of the household, work especially hard, and of course their husbands and their kids should help a lot. That's going to be the hope. But with all of this beautiful cleaning of the house, we have to remember there's also a spiritual dimension here. Chametz is a symbol of the Yetzer Hara, the arrogance of the Yetzer Hara. And when we try to eradicate the chametz, we're not just talking about bread and cookies, we're also talking about spiritually preparing ourselves. And the word Mitzrayim itself, the Balatanya writes, Mitzrayim is not only Egypt, but the word Mitzrayim, Meitzar, is boundary, constriction, blockage. And Yetzias Mitzrayim means we try to escape the blockages that imprison us in Avodas Hashem. A person can have a Mitzrayim of gaiva, of arrogance, of laziness, of depression, of resentment, of anger. This is Mitzrayim. And Yetzias Mitzrayim is to become free from that. So you really have 3 different jobs to do. You have to get rid of the physical chametz. One should also learn the halachos of Pesach. But then you also want to prepare spiritually. So probably the best thing to do is to learn the Haggadah as well as you can. Now, the problem with the Haggadah is very simple. The number of commentaries on the Haggadah is actually, I believe, greater than the number of commentaries on Chumash. Can you believe that? There are, 10,000 Haggadahs. And every year, like another 20 or more come out. Huge. Oh, you have another Haggadah there? Okay.
The Rav wrote a Michtav Bracha, and it was beautiful. A lot of people were speaking out in public from Moshe Hubner.
Oh, yeah, Yeshkayach. Thank you. Yeah. Very nice. This for me?
Yes.
Oh.
Another one that came out this year, that's what I'm saying.
Okay. Thank you. Another one. Oh, this is actually a very nice Haggadah. So you might want to look at this. So you're going to have to leaf through things. I mean, obviously, no human being is able to read every Haggadah, and not every Haggadah is going to be right for you. But it depends a little. I would look for a Haggadah in particular, although everyone's different, that emphasizes the notion of spiritual redemption. Because what you want to do is you want to apply Yetzias Mitzrayim to the Musar lessons that you can apply to your own life in struggling with your own Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the Seder becomes an exercise in a Yiras HaNefesh. So look, I would just urge you to look for a Haggadah that maybe talks about those themes. And by the way, that doesn't mean necessarily you're going to talk about it at the Seder. Sometimes most of, the Seder, sometimes, depending, you might have to do relatively quickly. You don't necessarily have time to be marich in long explanations. So a lot of this Haggadah work is what you do before the Seder. And maybe you'll only share small parts of it at the Seder, but at least for yourself, you've internalized a lot of important ideas. Okay, so Pesach is Yiras HaNefesh. Remember that the Mekubalim say the concept of time is not linear, but it's cyclical. Meaning it's not that we have past, present, future moving in a line, but rather time goes in like a circle. So the very moment of time that the Jews left Mitzrayim is the moment that I experienced during Pesach, that moment of time. And therefore all of the spiritual koach of redemption that existed in that moment of time comes back every single year, right? And then you can actually tap into that and you can experience it. Okay, did you have one last question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the first couple prakim of Mishlei, the idea is repeated, Reishis Chochmah, Yiras Hashem. What exactly is the significance of Yiras Hashem that leads to Chochmah?
Yeah, so you have to understand, Mishlei, this is a hard book to learn, because the dilemma of Mishlei is either the idea is obvious, or the idea is so obscure I have no idea what it's saying. So, for example, a pasuk in Mishlei might say, a false witness is a liar. Well, I mean, you wonder exactly, what is that telling me? False witness is a liar. Okay. But Mishlei is called Sefer HaChochmah, the book of wisdom. It is called that way. And you're correct that one of the famous psukim in Mishlei that's stated more than once, in sometimes slightly different wording, is, and we say it every day in Modani, Reishis Chochmah, the beginning of Chochmah Yosem. So I think the answer is you have to understand that Chochmah in Mishlei, and the Malbim says this, has a special meaning. Chochmah doesn't mean you're smart, and it doesn't even mean you know a lot of Torah. Chochmah is the clarity to understand what is the right thing to do in life and what is the wrong thing to do in life. People often have dilemmas. What's the right way of talking to my parents? What's the right way of dealing with a business transaction that might be a little questionable? We'll call it moral clarity. So when will a person have moral clarity? That comes from Yiras Hashem. When you're totally committed that I want to do Hashem's will, that will give you, Hashem will then give you the clarity to understand what is right and what is wrong. So I think if you understand that Chochmah refers to moral clarity, then there is a connection to Yiras Hashem in that way. That will give you the guide. Because without Yiras Hashem, what happens is your clarity gets obscured by personal agendas. You'll make more money that way, or whatever it would be. Money is a big age. The old saying, money is the root of all evil. I'm not saying we agree with that necessarily, because money has positive benefits, tzedakah, chesed, and the like. But money can really throw you off, meaning you will tend to look at something as the more moral derech if it's the one that'll get you most of the money. I mean, it literally changes your moral evaluation of situations. Because if it's not rooted legamri in Yiras Hashem, your personal agenda will throw off your moral compass. So that's the Reishis Chochmah, Yiras Hashem. Okay, this is it, right, till after Pesach. Okay, all right. So we shall see you next week. It's guys, but Yiras Somayach and a wonderful, wonderful Yom Tov.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.